Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. In Joseph Campbell's interview with Bill Moyers, he mentioned following your bliss. And he also mentions it in The Power of Myth, which is a book that came out of that interview. And so when he's talking to Moyers, he says at one point, in answer to the question, do you ever have a sense of being helped by hidden hands? And Campbell says, all the time, it's miraculous. And he says at some point in his response that if you do follow your bliss, you put yourself on a kind of track that has been there all the while, waiting for you. And the life that you ought to be living is the one that you are living. And then he talks about opening doors and meeting the right people and all that. In the book, The Power of Myth, Campbell also mentions reading the Upanishads and getting the word bliss from the word ananda, which does mean that. It also means joy and a fairly refined state of consciousness as well. So the idea of following your bliss has both become very popular and also very criticized. And I've read a number of criticisms by people, particularly in the corporate world, who say that it's impractical, that follow your bliss just means self-indulgence, and you can follow your bliss all you want, but if you don't make a living, then you're sunk. So that kind of criticism. And also criticism of what I think of as a kind of maybe new agey take on follow your bliss, which is that if you put good intentions out in the world, then you'll automatically have the right things happen. And that if the automatic right things don't happen, then you're doing something wrong. So I want to look at this whole question a little bit more carefully, and to start with, I'll mention that Campbell at one point used the word rapture. And he did say following your bliss isn't easy, but it's about following what you're passionate about, which to some people is supposedly impractical. So I want to tell a brief story of two fathers who had very different approaches to this question of following your bliss. And I'll start with the dad I grew up with, my adoptive father. And he basically would have said, we never talked about it, but he would have said it's nonsense. And when I told him at one point I wanted to earn a PhD in depth psychology, he said, well, what can you do for it in terms of money making? So for him, it was all about money making. It wasn't about knowledge or fulfillment of a dream or anything like that. It was about the cash, the money that comes in, right? And which is not to say that that's not important. Of course it is. But generally, and there's some research to back this up, by the way, when people spend their whole lives oriented on making money, they're generally not very happy. And my dad was an example of that. And he also wasn't very good at making money, frankly. He was never wealthy. And my dad spent his entire adult life in jobs that he thought would pay him well, and in the kinds of positions that he thought he should have because he was taught to do those positions. So he had an MBA, he graduated, and he had no real passion for business. Some people do, and they should pursue that. That's their bliss. But it wasn't my dad's bliss. He just thought that with an MBA and the right job, then he could make plenty of money, and he never did. He got laid off numerous times. He learned finally through painful experience that there's no such thing as a long-term job that you slot into. And this is back in, the 70s, the 80s. It's worse now. So he learned that the hard way. He finally did give himself some comfort by becoming a consultant, where he would go do safety inspections and get paid for that. So my dad was actually ahead of the home office curve. He had his own before it got popular. and he was much happier. He still wasn't living his bliss. He still did it just for the money, but at least he wasn't miserable anymore. So that's one man who never followed his bliss, just kind of followed what he thought was the right thing to do because his dad had said that, and his dad before him, if you work hard, you'll get far. Well, there's a lot of people that work really hard right now, and they're not getting anywhere. And some of them don't even have roofs over their heads. I've done, not recently, but I've done quite a bit of free work for people who are on welfare and people who are in various states of poverty, and they mostly are very hardworking people. And one of the things I learned from that is you can follow all the rules and work hard and still get nowhere. The system is stacked against you. Just look at the American tax system, right? It's completely in the pay of the rich. Should have been overhauled decades ago. Never should have ended up the way it did, actually. So that's one man's example. And then I'll invoke my birth father as a different example. And again, I never talked to him about following your bliss, but he did follow his bliss. And we did talk about how much he loved his career. So my birth father was a kind of human Icarus. And you might remember from mythology that Icarus is the one who flew high. And in my father's case, he didn't crash and burn. He just liked to fly. And so he was a pilot in the Marine Corps. And then when he came out of the Corps, which he absolutely hated, by the way, he set himself up as a flight instructor and a jump instructor. He taught people how to fly, how to jump out of planes. And then he did inter-island flying in Hawaii and loved it. And there's actually a picture of him. If I remember correctly, it's Sports Illustrated 1962. And it's a picture of a guy falling out of the sky with his arms stretched out like a bird before he had pulled the ripcord and opened his chute. And he just looks ecstatic. And of course, it's my father. So he had a very good career experience, except for being in the Marine Corps. That it just didn't suit his temperament at all. And he had bad experiences, traumatic experiences, actually. So he did follow his bliss and loved his career, loved to fly. And there are still comments you can find on the internet from people who were taught to fly by him. And they're still praising Lynn Pylan for what a great teacher he was. And he was humble about it. When I met him in my early 20s, we were getting to know each other. And he said, well, you can always tell a Marine, but not much. He had just had that kind of self-deprecating sense of humor, but he clearly loved what he did. So those are my examples, or I should say counterexamples, up against the idea that follow your bliss is nonsense. You should never do it. You should just do what's practical, which, of course, my dad did, and he was miserable the whole time, and it didn't even work practically. Like I said, he was laid off a bunch of times, and through no fault of his own. Always reminded me of this old police film called Nighthawks, where the character that plays the terrorist would make phone calls after we would blow things up, and he would always end with the same message: there is no security. That's the job market now, right? So when I teach in psychology programs and consciousness studies programs, and prospective students are wondering, should I get a license in something or certified in something or whatever, I always tell them it's no guarantee. There's programs that slot straight into a career. That career can go overseas or just vanish tomorrow, right? But the skills that you learn won't vanish. So make sure you acquire the skills that will serve you and give you some measure of happiness with what you do in life. And you can use them in a variety of situations. Now, in my case, I've kind of gone in and out of follow your bliss. And the times when my career hasn't felt good are the times when I forgot to follow my bliss. And Perhaps we should replace it with a different word and say follow your passion or your rapture. Campbell mentions those too. Bliss always makes it sound, at least in American English, like blissed out. Like, oh, just follow whatever makes you feel good. And he didn't mean it that way at all. He meant to follow what's alive for you, follow what summons you, what you have to do. When I teach and my students are writing different kinds of projects, master's thesis work or PhD work or what have you, I always ask them, how much alchemical fire do you have for this? Does it light you up? Do you think about it all the time? Is it a fascination? Do you want to pursue it? Because if so, then stick with it. But if not, it's going to become as a millstone around your neck emotionally. I went into a corporate job right out of college and I learned some really valuable skills. And I definitely stayed in that world too long as a technically oriented employee. So eventually I got out, and it was a dream that prompted me to. I was doing all the things I had been taught to do. I was married. We had a nice place to live in, rented though, not bought. And we had been talking about buying and maybe having kids. She had 2 sons. We were thinking about more kids. And, I had everything but the white picket fence, and I was depressed and wondering why. And I was thinking, well, anybody else in this situation would be happy, which of course is actually not true. So here I am in my early 30s, and I have a dream where a goddess-like presence is facing me. And in retrospect, I realized that she was my version of Sophia, wisdom. And she points at my right arm where I have a large birthmark on the inside of my arm. And she says, "Hey, Cain, how come you're covering up your mark?" And in the dream, I look down at my right arm and my left hand is over my birthmark. And then I wake up. So even way back then, I realized that the dream was telling me that in order to make things work at home and in the workplace, I was having to conceal everything about me that made me different and unique. And I would never be happy as long as I did that. So I consulted my fascinations and I realized that I wanted to do psychotherapy, which I did on and off for 9 years. And a day came in another dream that said, okay, you're probably getting tired of this too now. Time for the next thing. After which I went into higher ed as both faculty and administration. So for me, there hasn't been a single career or purpose that I'm supposed to stay with. And I think that's a big misunderstanding of what Campbell was saying too. He didn't seem to be suggesting that, at least as far as I can discover. As though there's one single calling out there for you, for everybody, and you should just do that. I think what he was suggesting was that if you follow your passions, your real ones, not just your moods, but if you follow what you really desire, you'll go where you need to go in life. And that has been my experience, even if I stayed around a little bit too long in places where I no longer belonged. Now, Campbell also mentioned mythic threshold guardians. These are the fearsome people or beasts or beings who guard the way forward, the portal to the next phase. And you have to figure out how to get past them. These figures come up all over the place. They're probably archetypal, and you see them in everyday life, and they're there kind of to test your resolve. They're not aware they're doing that, but so many years ago when I was talking to some coworkers about getting trained as a psychotherapist and doing that instead of working in an office, A couple of them said, yeah, when we were your age, we had dreams like that too. And we realized that really it's just about making a decent living and being as comfortable as you can in an uncertain world. And so a cynical interpretation of these people would be that they're dream killers and soul killers, but and there may be some aspect of that to them. In psychoanalysis they talk about spoilers, the people who try to wreck things for you because they're envious and they don't admit that to themselves. So there may have been some spoiling going on as well. But in a Campbellian sense, I think these people were there to toughen me up for the journey. They were there to teach me that following your bliss, as Campbell and Michael Mead have also put it, means following your blisters as well. That it's tough to follow your fascinations sometimes. It doesn't feel blissful. Sometimes it's just really hard and there's a lot of sacrifice and loss involved. And Campbell also pointed out that when these threshold guardians, these obstacles pop up, the helpers show up too. So, the same period of time, I had met my birth father and we were talking about it. And I said, well, what do you think? And he said, I think it's great you want to do something else. I can't see you being in the corporate world for much longer. You seem to hate it, and that's not good for you. You should go somewhere else. And if you like psychology, follow that up. And, he said, keep an eye on the practicalities, of course, but go in the direction that makes you happy. And I did, and that's always helped. That's always done well by me. Abraham Maslow had his own take on this. He didn't talk about follow your bliss, but he said that there are many decision points in life where the choice is between growth and safety. And when we fail to follow our passions, we're making a safety choice. But you can die of safety. Your soul can die of safety because you're always making the safe choices and you'll never do the hard stuff that gets you anywhere. Because that takes courage. And in the sphere of occupation and vocation, I sometimes have told students you need to prepare yourself if you want to be happy with your creativity for the kinds of jobs that don't exist yet and boldly pursue them anyway. And I take my own advice. I've been calling myself a laurologist and working in my second dissertation on founding a new profession, among other things, where we can look at the deep stories that we navigate by, including the ones out of fear, as well as the ones that are guided more by inspiration and expansiveness. Somewhere, Campbell also said that if you let yourself be intimidated by the threshold guardians, then maybe you're not ready for the journey. Maybe you need to wait a little longer for the call to come back again, so that this time you're strong enough or tough enough or brave enough to actually go on the journey. So if you are at a point in your life where you're ready to follow your bliss, your passions, your fascinations, there's no reason you can't be practical about it. So some people would say, well, just quit your job, right? Well, a lot of us don't have that option, especially if other people depend on us. But you can do both. You can follow your fascinations and see where they take you and do the homework, right? How much is this going to cost? What do I have to learn? What are the practical tasks I have to carry out in order to go from here to where I want to be? And I've seen a number of people, whether they're people who consult me or my students or whoever, colleagues, go down that kind of productive path into a wider world. We've all heard of career counseling. What I've done sometimes is a kind of bliss counseling and help people understand what is it that they want, what are the stories that need changing and updating, and how do they get from here to there? How do you even know what you want? We're so trained to stick to what we think we should do or what it's our responsibility to do. Or as the business people who criticize Campbell say, you should do what you're good at, right? But what if you hate what you're good at? I'm a good administrator. I don't like doing it, though. I'm not going to do it for the rest of my life. I'm also a good meeting facilitator. I've had training in how to do that. I recently put up a $15 course at my website. It's a 30-minute course on how to effectively facilitate meetings. And I can tell you, I much prefer doing the audios than in actually facilitating a meeting at work, right? I'm not going to do that for the rest of my life either. I've done that for decades. So that's enough of that. So, as far as I'm concerned, because you're good at it isn't enough of a reason to have a career built around it. Maybe a temporary bit of work, but not a career, let alone a vocation. The other thing, too, about this is Campbell, of course, was a product of American culture. And I'm pretty sure that the people who wrote down and also talked around the Upanishads, they were oral before they were written down. I'm pretty sure they didn't have work situations in mind when they said follow your bliss. And so here in the States, we tend to think in terms of, vocation, avocation, work, whatever. In fact, if you look at the etymology of America, keeping in mind that there are several Americas, there's more than one, but it goes back to a word that means work. So it's kind of in our DNA. But we have to bear in mind always that our fascinations may not have anything to do with work at all. If we can make work out of them, great. If we want to, maybe we don't want to. And who started this idea that we need some kind of a full time permanent job to begin with? I hated the 8 to 5. I really did, or 8 to 4, or actually it turns out to be like 8 to 8 for most of us. Because the people who run these companies, some of them are fair minded and great to work for, and others are completely exploitive. And, will work you to death if you let them. I've actually known people who died of work related heart attacks. So that's no way to live. If I had my life to do over again, I wouldn't have had any of these regular jobs, these office jobs, and I don't miss them, and I'm sorry I spent so much time in them. Although the upside is I got really good training. And I also got a close up look at what workplace abuse is like. I just saw a news story that Elon Musk, who's now taken over and almost destroyed Twitter, is building bedrooms, suites there so people never leave the premises. It's like, how far does it have to go before we call the thing abusive, right? I'm not seeing that in any of the news stories. Maybe they're there and I'm missing them. But why isn't anyone saying this guy basically wants wage slaves? He wants to control every aspect of his employees' lives, and he's not alone, right? So, I've reported to people who are really great and flexible and open minded and mature, and then others who were so bad I had to leave the job. But what I'm questioning is the whole basis of this. If you can do several things at once and make a living just fine, why not? And there's more and more people doing that, young people in particular, who see how miserable their parents are and say, I'm not going to do that. Why would anybody want to do that? So let's disconnect bliss, passion, whatever you want to call it, fascination, from the rigid framework of career, where it may or may not be a good fit depending on what your life and your goal and your interests are. And let's talk instead a little about the whole inquiry of what do I want. And where it stops for most people is they just ask their conscious mind that. But we're a lot more than our conscious mind. We're our whole somatic existence with our body and all of its unconsciousness, and the mind itself as an unconscious. We've got a rich array of relationships with other people, with the natural world, with the cosmos, most of which go disregarded. What is all that one? When we say I want, who's I? Do we even know? So this is why, especially in the programs I've taught in, we give people skills for listening to all that unconsciousness, all that unconscious wisdom, all that Sophia that's waiting to come in and advise us. We teach people how to pay attention to their dreams, how to free associate, how to actively fantasize. Jung called it active imagination. To look for synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem to be telling you something from outside yourself, and how events play out that would seem random to other people. Some among us use divination techniques, not to foretell the future, but to amplify what's going on with us. And then there's just plain old sitting with your feelings long enough for them to surface. Whether it's feelings of disappointment, disillusionment, frustration, whatever it is about something in your life right now. And then on the other side of that, what you hope for, what you dream of, what you seldom allow yourself to fantasize about, but should. Instead of follow your bliss, maybe we should call it riding your dragon. But you got to find the dragon first. Otherwise, it'll show up in physical and psychological symptoms, relationship conflicts, you name it. The dragon has a loud voice, but when we try to suppress it, the voice goes underground and it gets loud in other ways. So instead of showing up as a fascination, a rapture, or a passion, it shows up as symptoms. Until we pay attention, and then it can make itself heard. And for some of us, it's a matter of giving ourselves permission to hear that part of us. And to realize we have the right to be fascinated and to pursue a fascination, to follow up a passion, to grab a dream and see where it goes. And the nice thing about that dragon is it doesn't care how old you are. It doesn't care about the mistakes that you've made in your life or the missed opportunities or anything like that. All it cares about is your attention right now. It doesn't mind that some of your key relationships haven't worked or that your relationship with your family sucks or that you hate your job or that perhaps you're just down and out. It doesn't care about any of that. All it cares about is the present and where it points to up the road from here. And that's the thing about dragons. They know exactly where they want to go. And if you can get on their back, they'll take you along with them. And it may be a bumpy ride and go in unexpected directions, and there will be surprises somewhere on the flight, but at least you'll be warm. And you'll have a dragon's sense of direction. And maybe a dragon's sense of liberation, too. Ursula K. Le Guin said in an essay that very often we're afraid of dragons because we're afraid of freedom. And Erich Fromm, the psychoanalyst, pointed out that a lot of us are full-time in the business of escaping from freedom. He even had a book by that title, Escape from Freedom. Freedom is scary. Freedom demands responsibility and courage and an embrace of the unknown and a tolerance for uncertainty, none of which are comfortable if you choose for it to be. That doesn't mean the path you take will be easy by any means. In fact, if you've avoided it for this long, it'll probably be quite difficult, at least at first. But it's encouraging to think that a new path lies open at every moment, because it does. I was recently in San Diego sitting on a breakwater at twilight, and a drunk woman came up to me, and we struck up a conversation. And she mentioned that her name was Jennifer, and she was aware that her name harks back to Guinevere, the great queen of Camelot, whose story has treated so badly. And I told her that Camelot fell because Arthur disrespected Guinevere and that she brought the round table. So I don't know if this woman will remember anything that we talked about or make a different choice when she comes out of her hangover. But I hope so, because the possibility is always there for all of us under any circumstances. Thank you.